So this is one part, one half, the passionate storytellers. The other half is collaborating with companies, clients, musicians. And there's this, like, people don't usually get this, that producing and the money part is one half, and managing people, managing the egos is the other half. So how do you approach the negotiation with the companies, clients, musicians? And as you said right now, that some directors are not production friendly. So that part as well. How do you go about that, like managing people?
Very good question again, because negotiations is something that you just learn on the way,
Mm-hmm.
uh, like especially like contractual negotiations and stuff like that. Those are things, like I said, like once you actually start reading contracts, and you start getting a hang of what it actually means to have a specific clause in there,
Yeah.
or what kind of control you're giving up with a specific clause, you understand those things.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to monetary discussions, again, very challenging, because initially people don't want to give you money.
Yeah.
They don't want to trust you with money.
Yeah.
And that's a decision that I took when we were very young, in the production scale, that for the first few years we are not going to we're not going to try and run a hyper profitability model,
Mm-hmm.
rather a hyper growth model.
Mm-hmm.
So wherever I was negotiating for more money, I was making sure that the places where I'm negotiating for more money is not to pay us as creatives more, and not for a production house to make a larger production fee,
Mm-hmm.
or not for Daria or for writers or for any other talent. Because I had convinced all of them that, right now, if someone gives you X amount of money, rather than you making half of that in just creative fees and like your time and effort,
Mm-hmm.
if you reinvest that money for a few years in back onto the screen to make larger than life visuals,
Uh-huh.
to deliver projects that look and feel much larger budget than they actually are, over the years you'll build a much stronger growth scenario for yourself, you know
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
um, so I think that was something that was really important for me, for a decision for me to take,
Mm.
because a lot of producers who do commercials or shorter format work, they come into it wanting to make money,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
they are like, we will not take on a project unless we make that much money. I have taken on projects where I have made no money, because I've known of the prestige, or not even the prestige, but I've known that this project is going to allow me and my
Yeah.
creative team
Mm-hmm.
to be as truthful as possible.
Mm.
So as long as I know that the creator with me is coming hands on, or whoever we're doing it with, whether it's a brand or an
Mm.
agency or a musician or a music label or anyone,
Mm-hmm.
if they're willing to co-create and give me space, um, to create the way I want to,
Mm.
I don't mind taking a haircut on money. But if you come in and you tell me I want it exactly like this and
Yeah.
there's no space to move,
Uh-huh.
then I will charge you a premium, because then I know
Okay.
all you're doing is taking my time,
Uh-huh.
and you're taking my creative kind of
Mm-hmm.
ability and my approach and my rigor to give you a factory made product that you have already created. So then
Okay.
I know that I need to make that much money, because it's not that satisfying for me. But
Okay.
I know if there's a project which for
Uh-huh.
me is something that's really interesting, and I know it's going to help me grow as a
Mm-hmm.
storyteller, or one of my directors grow,
Mm-hmm.
or anything like that, or if there's a director who really wants to take on a project
Mm-hmm.
but I'm not going to make that much money on it, and the director themselves is willing to forfeit their large directorial
Uh-huh.
fees, then I know that I'm doing this to build a relationship with a specific director,
Mm.
or to build a relationship
The foresight. Yeah.
specifically or a label or someone.
Mm-hmm.
I'm completely open to that. Yeah, it's
Okay.
because it's a long term game, right? Like I've been in this
Yeah.
industry. I've only had my production house a year and a half,
Mm-hmm.
and like I know that this is a long term kind of entertainment model that I want to build
Right.
as a
Mm-hmm.
business. So I need to be able to do good work to then eventually be able to command larger budgets.
Uh-huh.
Um,
And what
so that's
happens
really,
when things don't work out? Like a brand, you want a project, but the brand wants you to compromise on the story you want to tell, and you understand that part better, but they just want to enforce the product. So do you fight for the product you want to deliver, or do you just where do you surrender? Okay, okay, ठीक है, this is the amount of money I'm getting, so we can just compromise this much. But where is that? Where do you draw the line that okay, no, you can't push me this much? Because sometimes like you have worked
um,
with big brands and big musicians and
right.
everyone, so where do you draw the line as a producer, as a creative person as well?
Um, I think it's again a very, very good question, very specific question, and very important question. I think it would depend from project to project.
Mm-hmm.
But there comes a point when you will have a specific agency or a specific brand where it feels exploitative.
Ah.
It feels like they want you to do work. Like where their idea is so large, where they've written such a, I mean, or their media buying or their campaign size is going to be so big. But just because we are a young production team and they know that we are willing to work cheap, they're trying to squeeze you out.
Yeah.
So that's just an intuitive process that you understand, because you know with the conversation that they're having and the idea that they've built is so large, but the budget that they have for production clearly looks much lower than everything else, you know. At that point, it kind of red flags me, and then I have specific ways that I use to kind of then get out without being very disruptive and very rude, you know. And often there are some times when you know that the person's intention is right, but they actually don't have that much money. And it may be a young musician who may not have done a lot of work, but you love their music and they love you, and you have this mutual admiration kind of society built between each other. And then it's your call, then for example, like right now there's this young rapper who Dar and me really love, and who has no money, but we love him, and we want to do like a whole bunch of work with him. And we've decided now that we want to start like a music collective,
Oh, nice.
of young talented musicians who may not have got like the right kind of record deal, or may not have got the right kind of platform to put their music out. In which case we want to start a creative collective. And since we work with a lot of the largest music labels in the country, we know a lot of the executives, we know a lot of the people who run the stuff for them, so we are able to help kind of bridge those gaps.
Nice.
So I think that's a really important thing. I think going back to a question that you had before this, which is also a very important question, is how do you manage egos, right? Because at the end of the day, as a director or as a producer, you're really managing people's artistic egos, financial egos, and across the board, because like a DP, for example, will come in with a specific vision. A production designer will come in with a specific vision. A sound designer will come in. At the end of the day, while all of those are really integral parts of building a project, the director's vision is the most important, because she's seeing or he's seeing everything really come together on a larger scale, right? So even though a DP may want to take a shot that looks really beautiful, it may not have the same emotional texture that the director needs for the edit, and then the editor will not use that shot. Even though it's taken 5 hours to take, he may not use that shot because the editor has his own or her own artistic ego, which needs to be fulfilled. So I think that's something that again just comes through experience and through time. I feel like being very well prepared and having a very clear vision helps, because when a director or a producer have a very clear vision of what they want, each and every department head that you eventually collaborate with, they understand the amount of clarity that you're coming in with. And really, and of course, you'll have those one or two examples of departments head of DPs or production designers who may just be artistically egoistic no matter what, and then you know that it's not jamming with you. They may work well with other directors and producers, but with you it's just not working. And then you know that you should avoid collaborating with them on certain types of projects, But on a general thumb rule, at least with all the people that we've worked with, especially all the talented people, all of them come with their own egos. All of them come, I wouldn't call it egos, but come with their own approach, come with their own vision, come with their own kind of very, very that they bring onto a project. But then when they see that Daria or me or any of the other directors are so prepared, like Daria or me when we're producing, or any of the directors that we work with are so prepared with what we want, that they understand that, okay, these people are not coming from a space, we don't take decisions from a space of artistic ego. We take decisions from a space of what's best for that project. And as soon as someone understands that, no matter how experienced they are, they automatically come down to your level, because what happens is in this industry, so many people act from a space of pure self-ego, not even artistic ego, not even that, just that because I'm more experienced than you, I know what's happening. Lots of artists and lots of collaborators, they come jaded, they come pissed off. Especially people who work within the advertising industry and stuff, they come frustrated. So when they come, like I know when someone has been frustrated by doing 50 commercials back to back and they come to us, and then Daria almost has to do like a meditation session with them to like, bring them back to like, listen, we're creating art, we're not just running around like headless chickens trying to deliver something to an agency or to, something. we have to create within our own sensibility, and we have to come back to our sensibility and our own approach to create pure, truthful films and narratives.
Okay. So while doing like while the production is going on, what is your approach? What is your job on set? Because you've been you have been titled as associate director on many of the music videos you have created. But as a producer and as an associate director, how do you approach being on set? Because it's very important that the crew is happy, so the product doesn't suffer. So what is your approach towards that?
I mean, yeah. See, you know, the like you had rightly mentioned in the beginning of the when you were introducing the talk, that cinema and filmmaking is one of the most expensive art forms. Because it just requires so many people to come together to make it, and you're always running against a clock. No matter who you are, whether I'm doing a small home production or whether I'm Martin Scorsese, everyone wants more days on the sound floor to film. You know, everyone wants more days. Every director wants more days. There's no director who will say, "Oh no, that's enough for me," you know, and there's no producer who will say that's enough for me. So I think that's something that you have to remember, that you always need more time. And at the end of the day, when you go into actual production after development and after you've committed to your screenplay and after you've committed and you're sure that this is the best way you want to move forward with this particular material, then the whole logistical nightmare begins, right? Of how to film, whether to do it in 50 days or 60 days or 30 days or in 2 shifts or 4 shifts, or what location is better, what location is worse, what location do we need to paint less, do more. So then starts a whole other process, you know, which is just project management. And while most people think that project management is not creative, that's absolutely untrue. Because like for example, like I personally will not be able to run or do any of my productions without few people in my company. Like my now someone who's been producing a lot of the content for us and like really taking charge of, and also a very talented director, is a guy called Pranit Sahani. So he directed Bombay Dreams and Baatein Karo, and he's produced a whole bunch of other stuff that we've done in the last 1 year. So now every director that I've worked with, when Pranit's on their production, they're all very comfortable because he approaches his work like a director. He knows what the director would need. He knows the kind of where to constrict and where to be completely open, you know, where to give time, where to, kind of hold time, shrink time. What to put money in, where, how much, like, how much a story requires. Like when you have a story, we do like breakdowns of it, right? So you get a complete breakdown of how many extras you have, what kind of production design you need, what kind of VFX is going to come in. So you have this master breakdown sheet, and then we have a way that we tally our numbers to understand what requires how much of the resources, you know. Like, for example, some projects, they need a lot of production design. Some projects you can do without production design at all and shoot in real locations. And then you can put a lot more money into, like, say, for example, getting the right kind of music composer or getting a much more talented or larger edit team, because you know you're going to need to edit more. So I think each project has its own kind of its own approach. And I think it's really important that for a producer to approach all their projects when they get material, to approach it creatively, to understand what for a film to happen, what aspect of the production process needs most nourishment. So I think that's a really important talent to have as a producer, to be able to identify that. And for example, Pranit has a really uncanny ability to be able to identify that very quickly, sometimes even before I can. Sometimes even though he's someone who's kind of started his journey with us, he used to work, he's an engineer by education, and he used to work as a supervising, or not even as supervising, just as a young kind of creative producer at Byju's. And then he moved to Bombay, and his first job was with us, and that was a year and a half ago. And since then he's just grown so dramatically that today I learn things from him, you know, from time to time, from a production standpoint. And he has an uncanny ability to be able to break down the most essential part of every film that we make.
Yeah,
And then he knows where that essential parts needs the most nourishment from resources, and how everything else then needs to be balanced perfectly so that they still stay afloat. You know. So I think that's great. I think also building trust-based relationships with the crew is really important. You know, like, because like having a really strong first AD is like, if you don't have a strong first AD, for example, you're as good as a headless chicken on a set. You know, you're as good as not being able to produce anything. Because if someone's not running your set strong and making sure deadlines are being met from that perspective, you're gone. If you have a production designer or a DP who's not as engaged as you are to keep costs low, to make sure things happen fine, you could go overboard. If you're not, if your entire crew, I'm talking about your light boys, your spot boys, your prop leads, or prop masters, or makeup, across the board, you know, drivers, even like drivers, for example, are super important, because as a production, you could say that you want to start filming at 6 o'clock, but if your 22 drivers all decided to show up late, you ain't starting for 2 hours. So just having drivers and transport management could save you crores and lakhs or crores of rupees, you know, on larger productions. So one of the things that we do, and something that Daria had introduced to us through our filming process, which is now what we do as a production house overall, is that at the start of every film or the start of every project, we do a ritual where we involve each and every person from the crew, each and every person. It doesn't matter, even if you're just a cleaner from the location who theoretically has nothing to do with the film crew. But as long as you are on our set or in and around our set, we all come together, we all hold hands, and we do this sort of like self-aware meditation, you know, which involves, and it's really interesting, the process of that meditation also is very interesting, where it involves all of us holding hands, and all of us looking at the world from the person who's on the right of us or on the left of us.
Oh, nice.
And it's never that the actors are standing next to light men, or the light men are standing next to DPs. So it's all across the board, and we're all holding each other's hands. And through this, and we shut our eyes and we imagine the world through each other's eyes.
Nice.
So often then I imagine, like say, for example, as a producer, I may have a car that brought me to the set, you know. So I woke up slightly later than everyone else, or maybe I woke up the earliest and like did other work, but like I had a car that brought me directly. But if I'm shooting in Bombay, there may be a light man who's taken a rickshaw and a train, or a bus and a train, and then come and then taken another bus and woken up 4 hours before me. So how do I put myself into his position where he's eventually getting paid the same amount of money that he gets paid on any other day, right? So for him, it's just another job. It's just another job. He wants to make sure he doesn't piss off his gaffer or his DP, so that he makes sure that he gets another job again. So that's all he'll put in. But how do I make him put in the same effort as me if he's not getting paid much more than that? If he's just getting paid what the union rate is, or, you know, or what the film can afford paying him. So I feel like engaging them in this kind of ritual gives them a sense of connection to the whole film. Because what Dar always says is that, look, I don't want you to just be a light man here. You're not just a light man here. You're not just someone who's holding a light or putting up a skimmer or something like that. You are creatively adding to my film. So whatever you do, the end audience will see. So if you don't approach your work with love, the end audience is not going to feel that love. So even if we're running against time, even if whatever, no matter what, even if like everything is going haywire, she will pull the crew together and do this ritual. And what we've seen, at least, is that then we've seen that each and every person on the set approaches it from a different perspective. Because sometimes, you know, these guys are doing so many commercials and like, you know, they get this given food, different caters, catering A, catering B, catering. We don't have any of that. There's no different food. Each and every person eats the same food on our set. Maybe the actors will get slightly different food because they may be on specific diets that may not allow them to eat Indian food. They may just want to eat salad, and you know, the rest of the team, like I, for example, cannot survive on salads, so I need to eat properly. So they may get something specific which is healthy, but everyone else, including Daria, me, whoever else, we all stand in the same line. We all eat the same food. We treat everyone as a purely equal person on the set. And I know lots of production houses do this. We're not the only people. But I think that's been, this ritual, for example, has been an essential part of us being able to push and do 20-hour shifts. You know, of course, we pay people for the extra shifts and all, but energy drops, you know. But
Yeah,
somehow
yeah,
we see that each and every person has been invigorated while doing
yeah.
work with us. So I
Okay.
think that's been an essential part as well.
And after the film is done, you're done with the film, and how do you plan the distribution, and how good is OTT for you, and how important was the film festival circuit you did with Namdev Bhau? Like, how did that help you in finally distributing the film to a larger audience? What was your approach while distributing the film or the videos you make? Anything?
So I think I'll start with the films because that's
Huh.
slightly more complicated. Distribution has always been my biggest pet peeve, you know, because the distribution and the way the exhibition and distribution network works in India
Yeah.
is that it's very, very limited to just mainstream Bollywood cinema. With regional language films, it's slightly different. But if you're doing Hindi language films, if you don't have a star in it, there is no distribution for you. Either you have to have a star or you have to have a massive studio that's willing to put 10 or 15 crores into a PNA for distributors and exhibitors to even start taking you seriously, you know? And I'm talking about 10 or 15 crores on the lower end of PNA. Where otherwise, if you're doing an independent film, like my film may have a budget of 80 lakhs, you know, I cannot raise or 1 crore. I mean, I cannot raise 10 crores to put into a film, into distribution. You know what I mean? It just doesn't make sense, especially because there's no star. So, and luckily with 3.5 at that time, it was the onset of the OTT boom in India. And Netflix was looking for prestigious titles that had done a lot of festivals. And we had already distributed internationally 3.5 in a couple of theatrical markets. Like in Japan, we had a few screenings. In Korea, in South America, we had a few screenings here and there. A few distributors had bought us. And then Netflix came in and took off world rights, basically.
Oh, nice.
And now once an OTT platform comes in and takes off your world rights, you can't distribute the film theatrically or anything anywhere. Because it just doesn't make sense you know, for any theater or any distributor there to take on the film because it's available on Netflix. People can anyways watch it on Netflix. So with Namdev Bhau, we decided to go a slightly different route because since we already had the Netflix distribution on the first one and we knew what the pros and cons were of that, with Namdev Bhau, we said we'd rather sit on the film, even though it's been, I think, a year since its first festival, a year and a couple of months since its first festival, actually a year and a half since its first festival. We sold theatrical distribution rights over the last 6 months to various territories worldwide, and they've all told us to hold on the OTT sale because they've already given us like minimum guarantees and stuff for it. So we made some recoupment on that, and now they've told us to hold because of this whole pandemic situation, and they wanted to do like some of them wanted to do spring releases, some of them wanted to do post-summer releases. But now since this film is so small and they have such a large kind of hold up on so many titles, they're pushing our releases till December, you know, when it gets cold in Europe and people watch more films. They're pushing our release till then. And what they've done is they've requested us to hold back on the OTT because if we do sell to OTT, then we need to go back and buy back all those rights from them. So our Canadian sales agent has kind of like told us, listen, let's just wait on it and let's see what happens. Simultaneously, the OTT scenario in India has changed a lot since we sold 3.5 to them. They are looking now, most of the OTTs, they are paying premiums only for content that's been theatrically distributed or has stars or has someone well known in it. While in 3.5, we still had some of that. With Namdev Bhau, we just have Namdev Bhau, you know, who's like a driver. So, so we know that we're not going to be able to achieve the kind of premium that we want for it. So what we've decided now is that towards the end of the year, we found a couple of financiers who want to come in and help us do a small theatrical distribution of the film within the Indian scenario and specifically within the Marathi scenario. Because the first 18 minutes of the film are Marathi and the rest then meanders into Hindi, Marathi, Ladakhi, whatever each person speaks, what's most naturally prevalent to them, but it's 90% Hindi after that. So someone has come in and given us an interesting proposal of dubbing the entire film in Marathi and releasing it as a commercial Marathi movie. So rescoring the film, repackaging the film, the posters, trailer, everything, and making it a really interesting Marathi movie. So while Dar, of course, as the creator wants to be very careful with that, she's open to the idea and actually really excited about the idea. But the creative and not the creative, but like the essence needs to still remain. And that's where we're still kind of battling with because they want to make it much larger, wider audience than what we had in mind. But we're still figuring that out. with my newest film Cello Show, which is a Gujarati picture, which is perhaps the largest production I have done till now from a feature film perspective, because it's a Indo-French Belgian co-production, mostly financed out of Belgium and France. Orange Studio has come on board to do sales of the film, and again, because of the COVID pandemic, we've had to stop our post-production, like actually finishing the film. So right now, our edit, sound design, sound mix, DI, everything is happening in Paris, and all of the entire plan had to be halted because Paris was in absolute lockdown as well. So now we're just slowly restarting all our work, and we should have hopefully the film ready by the end of the year or early 2021. Nice. Is what we're targeting. And festivals are a really important part of sales, because otherwise, how else does a local, like if I don't go to, for example, Busan, how will a Korean or Chinese distributor watch my film? If I don't open in Cannes or in Toronto, how will I get a French or German distributor to watch my film, you know? If I just go to Cannes market, there are close to 5,000 films in the Cannes market where they're trying to get distributors to watch their film. So the only way to cut through all the noise is to get a very strong festival distribution or a festival presentation, where then Cameron Bailey or, you know, whoever, Toronto or Palm Springs or whoever picks up the film, they make sure that there's a lot of press and stuff done around it. So then, say if you're in Palm Springs, then a North American producer comes to you and says, oh, you know, my executive was watching films in Palm Springs. They really loved your film. How can we collaborate on distributing a film in America? So I think that's what's really important. However, now OTT platforms, unless it's a really, really strong festival film that's won a lot of awards, what my understanding is that they're trying to stay away from festival titles because they're trying to do more like series and more like very engaging blockbuster kind of films, which theoretically festivals may not pick up. So festivals do have their pros and cons. In an ideal scenario, me as a producer, I would not want to rely on festivals for distribution, because at the end of the day, when you release a film in a festival, two or three critics can make or break your film. You know, if 3 critics write badly about your film, you may have no distributor who wants to pick it up. Or 3 critics who write good, all distributors want to pick it up. So I personally would avoid having that. But for a specific kind of movie, if you want international distribution, and if you don't have one of the large Hollywood studios that comes in for worldwide distribution, like a Sony Pictures Classic or a Paramount or a Warner or a Disney or whatever, if you don't have any of those guys on your film, then you need to go the festival route. You need to go to international sales agents like Wild Bunch or Orange or Memento, who can then themselves mount a whole distribution of it.
And the final question, which is, like, do you think commerce kills art? And if it does, how do we protect it? And if it doesn't, how do we balance it? Like, where do we draw the line? Or where do you draw the line? Let's make it personal.
Again, great question. It's, well, I mean, from a purely artistic standpoint, yes. I mean, you could say that commerce does affect artistic vision, because often you have to take decisions based on commerce than purely art, like
artistic, especially,
purely an artist vision. However, they do go hand in hand, right? At the end of the day, all art at the end of the day does go hand in hand with commerce. Where even like the greatest artists of the Renaissance, so Michelangelo or Da Vinci or any of them, could not have worked or done the works that they've eventually created, that we've grown to love over time, without the support of the Medici family, or without the support of the papal fund or the papal commissioning, like, for example, the Sistine Chapel, right? Because at the end of the day, artists need a canvas to make their art on, right? Whether that canvas may be an actual canvas in
paintings,
for Michelangelo or whatever paintings, or for us it could be actually putting crews together and doing that, right? So I do feel like at an initial stage, especially in our life, we do need to focus on getting something that's effectively working for commerce as well. And hopefully, as most artists do, we all hope and pray that eventually we'll come to a point where we can tell our stories without having to like decide commercially. But I do feel that even today, the most artistic directors in the world who make what may seem like very artistically indulgent projects, even they take micro decisions that are commerce based, you know.
Yeah.
Specifically, like they say for example, a French director who I love may make a very 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 like narrow audience film, but will still want Marion Cotillard in it, you know, because having her would make distribution that much easier for him. So at the end of the day, you have to take decisions that, and specifically with film, there's so many chapters to your process, right? Like we have to live with films for 5 years. Like a director may live with the film for a year and a half, and that's it, you know, 2 years. An actor may live with the film for 4 months. A DP may live with the film for 4 months. Whereas a producer, I need to live with the film for 19, 20 years. I have to do accounts for the next 15 years, wherever the film is getting sold, any rights, DVD, OTT, here, there, I have to make sure all those accounts are being done. So I have to live with the film for much longer than my artistic passion for it, you know. So I can't take a decision purely based on what makes sense at that moment, but I have to take a decision based on a 20-year plan, or at least a 5-year plan, you know. And I know sometimes where I've taken decisions based on intuition rather than commerce, and I know where that's backfired on me later, you know, or vice versa, where I've taken a commerce decision rather than an intuitive decision. So I do think that they go hand in hand. I don't think that they're mutually exclusive of each other, as much as we'd all love for them to be. And yeah, I just think that we are responsible at the end of the day. Like, say, for example, even if I was making a film which had huge artistic value, which had huge, you know, kind of a huge leap and bound that we were taking artistically or cinematically, which was very indulgent or whatever. And there was a financier who came on board to do that, who gave me that $1 million or $2 million to make that movie. And they knew that most probably this money will go, you know, like with some of Kusturika's films or some of like Zia Janke's films or Naomi Kawase, for example, they don't make money, but they still are able to find finance. For Europeans and for Japanese and for Americans, it's very different because not Americans, but Europeans and Japanese, it's very different, and some Asians and Koreans and stuff, because they have government support funding, where the government themselves comes in and gives you money, sometimes $3-4 million to make art, where no one is responsible for that money. It's taxpayers' money, you know, even though there may be a recoupment position and all, like Eurimage and stuff have a recoupment position on them. They're not really a single investor, equity investor's money. Within the Indian perspective, NFDC stopped financing films in the 1990s. That's where the parallel cinema of the 80s ended. You know, Govind Nilani and stuff were able to make Papi and those movies because NFDC gave them money to make it. When NFDC money ended, now we completely rely on private equity investors to put money in films. So how can I, like, unless that equity investors like the Medici family, where they'll be like, you know what, we just want to support art blindly, which personally I've never met anyone who's wanted to do that. And if I do, I guess I'll get lucky. But if it's a private equity investor who's finally putting in the money, I feel responsible for that person's money, because I may take $1 million and go out and make something and no one will watch, but then I've dried up that resource for me for the rest of my life. So if I am working with an investor, I want to make sure that investor makes his or her money back, so that I could go back to them for my next project, which may need 5 million, you know. And I know that if eventually all my projects are able to turn themselves around commercially, I know I'll be able to keep myself going and tell larger and larger projects and take larger and larger risks, you know. And film is, and cinema in general, and now I'm talking about theatrical, or not theatrical, but just feature films. It is a very high risk, high return model. You know, you take high risks, you make 10 films, of which one film could make you back money of 20 films. All could flop, or none could work, or all could work. You know, you just have no idea. So in some sense, you have to mitigate that risk slightly and make sure that you're playing within the knowledge of that risk. You know.
So on that note, I just want to ask, what's coming next from Jugaad Motion Pictures? Recently you released Kasoor, which again went viral. Everyone loved it. I loved it. What's next from Jugaad Motion Pictures?
I think, I mean, you know, this whole pandemic and the whole 2020 scenario has thrown us off our growth plan completely. We were supposed to start a feature film this year. which is supposed to be a slightly more mainstream Bollywood feature. With a larger studio, and we were supposed to all of those processes were on point, and now all of that has been pushed back by 6 or 8 months. We're really looking at the series space, which is something that we hadn't done earlier. Again, because my approach Dar and me personally, our approach had always been that we love the cinematic art form, the art form of films, of the 80 to 140 minute model or whatever. Sometimes if you want to go crazy, then 300-minute model, but like of doing feature length
films,
narrative films. But since 3 years ago till now, the whole watching culture of people has changed completely. People don't go to the cinema to watch movies anymore. People go to the cinema to watch IMAX movies, and they'll go to watch Tenet, or they'll go to watch the new Christopher Nolan picture, but they may not want to go and watch a film that I'm doing, a smaller, smaller like social drama, comedy. It could be anything. It could be fun. It could be a great movie. But a lot of people, including me, sometimes I wait for things to come to OTT to watch it on my TV, my large TV at home, rather than go to the cinema to watch it, So I think as watching has changed and as people's consumption of entertainment has changed over the last 3 years, we realized that we also need to focus on series. So we've started developing a couple of our original series and series IPs, which we've started pitching, and we've had a huge response from them. From some of the leading OTT platforms. We've also been greenlit for one of them. Can't reveal any information yet. But we've got a development green light for a couple of our series. So we're also looking at that. And we're still focused on telling feature-length films. We're working with a whole bunch of exciting young directors. Of course, we're housing a lot of the Dar Guy projects, which are really interesting, which I'm very excited about personally. We're also working with Pan Nalin on a lot of projects. There's another young talent called Pranav Bhasin, who I'm really excited about, who we want to do a feature with this year. So yeah, just super excited. We're committed to continue telling, creating really high quality entertainment for people. And I say entertainment because at the end of the day, that's like, while I truly have a very deep kind of artistic ego, and I watch a lot of foreign language films, I go to festivals sometimes just to watch movies, and I highly appreciate it. I do feel like the new age, we're moving into a perspective, into a world where I don't want to call something art house. I don't want to call something, because audiences are now open to watching films with meditative rhythm. They're open to watching films with slightly more slow burning themes. It's just how it's packaged. And if it's packaged as entertainment, people will watch it. So even if you're doing something highly artistic, if it's packaged well as entertainment, people will watch it. And I feel like certain producers in America, all who have now become dogs through the Me Too scenario or whatever, they've, like people like Harvey Weinstein and Brett Ratner, they were able to understand bridging that gap. They were able to understand how to tell highly artistic films, but package them as entertainment and as movies. I think a lot of exciting stuff, a lot of cool collaborations coming up in 2020. And hopefully you should see a lot more stuff from us.
Excited, really excited. So on that note, thank you so much for joining us. I had a lot of fun. I guess the audience, this is one of the longest episodes we have done, and I guess there's so much to just learn from you, and I hope you had fun as well.
And I had a great time. Thank you, Vidar. Your questions were all very insightful. Usually I don't do these talks and stuff. Daria and Aditya and the creatives and actors and stuff usually do it because I mean, it's really, it's great to hear from them, their process and stuff. But I think your questions were really insightful, and it helped me understand a bit of my process better.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.